Hello everyone, this is Micah History, and welcome to another video. Today, as you can tell from the title, we will be asking ourselves, who was the first pope? Now, unless you've been living under a rock, you might have noticed that, Pope Francis died recently, and in fact, a successor for him has been chosen yesterday. At least yesterday at the time of recording. It might take a little longer for this video to come out. But, we of course know who the current pope is, but have you ever asked yourself who actually was the first pope? Now, if you look this up, and if you ask a Catholic, it's a very clear and simple answer. That was St. Peter. He was one of Jesus' apostles. However, and not to be too biased here, it is highly unlikely that Peter would recognize the papacy as it stands today. And so the question this video will try to answer is, when did the papacy, in its more recognizable form, become a thing? But this begs the question of what exactly a pope is and what their role is. Now, from a very basic point of view, the pope is the head of the Catholic Church and the Bishop of Rome. However, today he is much more than that. He is also the absolute monarch of the Vatican City, the world's smallest country, the Vicar of Christ, and he also has papal infallibility, which is a doctrine we'll get to later. Now, depending on how broadly or narrowly we define the role of the Pope, we get different answers. But in this video, I will go through the evolution and history of the papacy and discover which key moments turned the papacy into what it is today, so that we can later come to some kind of conclusion. To start off, we need to understand the origins of the papacy, at least according to the Catholic Church. Now, this all traces back to the life of Jesus, as recorded in the 13th chapter of the Gospel of Matthew. Verse 13 says, "When Jesus came into the region of Caesarea Philippi, he asked his disciples, saying, 'Who do men say that I, the Son of Man, am?' Verse 14 continues, 'So they said, some say John the Baptist, some Elijah, and others Jeremiah or one of the prophets.'" It is clear that most people at this time perceived Jesus to be a prophet. But the crucial moment comes in verse 16, where his apostle Simon says, "You are the Messiah, the Son of the living God." Now, this was a very significant statement, because the Jews had long been awaiting for their Messiah. And by the way, the word Messiah means anointed one, and he was expected to deliver them. However, what was much more groundbreaking was Simon's statement that Jesus was the Son of God, which was both a royal and, of course, a divine title. Now, Jesus responds to this declaration by blessing Simon and said, "I also say to you that you are Peter, and on this rock I will build my church, and the gates of Hades shall not prevail against it." Now, there is a lot to unpack here, so let's go through this statement. The word Peter means rock. If the conversation happened in Greek, the name he gave Simon was Petros, a play on words with the Greek word for rock, which is Petra, a feminine word. But if the exchange happened in their native language of Aramaic, the word for both Peter and rock is the same, which is Kepha. Additionally, for those who don't know, Hades means hell. Now, the word church probably didn't stand out to you here, but it is very important. It was the first time the word is ever mentioned in the Bible, and refers to a community of believers, also known as ecclesia in Greek. After this statement, Jesus continued in verse 19 by saying, "I will give you the keys of the kingdom of heaven, and whatever you bind on earth will be bound in heaven, and whatever you loose on earth will be loosed in heaven." Now, stepping back, a lot has happened in this short exchange. This moment essentially marks the start of Christianity, at least from a doctrinal standpoint, since this is the very first mention of Jesus as God by one of his followers. It is also the very first mention of the word church, and more importantly, Jesus establishes the foundation of the church. But what matters here is that Simon is renamed as Peter, and Jesus said that on this Peter, or rock, the church will be built. Now, many Protestants interpret this interaction to mean that upon the declaration of Jesus as God, the church will be built, which makes sense given that it is this declaration that immediately precedes Jesus renaming Simon to Peter, and the belief in Jesus as God is obviously the most important aspect of Christianity. However, it is also most likely true that Jesus literally meant that his church would be built on Peter, and therefore he was the foundation of this new emerging church. Now, I personally hold to both views. I'm a Protestant, by the way, in case you didn't know, and I see both Peter's declaration to be the foundation of Christianity. After all, he does proclaim Jesus to be the Son of God, but I also see Peter as being the first leader of the church, since it is fairly straightforward that Jesus is building his church on Peter. Now, when it comes to verse 19, things get interesting because Peter is given the keys to the kingdom of heaven and the authority to bind and loose in heaven. Now, most non-Catholic Christians interpret this to mean that he was the head authority of the church, but that the same authority is later given on to the other apostles in Matthew chapter 18, verse 18. However, Catholics believe this to mean that Peter alone holds the keys to the kingdom of heaven, and therefore so do the popes to this day. In fact, this explains why there are keys on the papal coat of arms. So what does all this mean in practice? According to Catholics, this interaction forms the basis of Petrine primacy, which means that Jesus gave Peter authority to rule over the entire church. After Jesus' resurrection, Peter was the first to enter his empty tomb, and after meeting with the risen Jesus, he was told by Jesus to take care of his flock. After Jesus ascended to heaven, he left a small group of followers in Jerusalem, which became the first church. It is believed by Catholics that Peter became the first bishop of Jerusalem, but that after the persecution of Herod Agrippa, who was the king of Batanea, Galilee, and Judea, in other words, basically modern Israel/Palestine, Peter was forced to leave Jerusalem and wound up in Rome. Now, while it is never explicitly stated in the Bible, there is good evidence that Peter did actually end up in Rome, as tradition, church writings, and excavations under the Vatican have all pointed to. However, whether he actually became bishop there is another matter. According to Catholics, the belief that he became the city's first bishop forms the basis for the Bishop of Rome's claim to lead the entire church. But even if we assume he was the bishop, where does this idea that this authority was passed on come from? Here is where we will need to understand the concept of apostolic succession. Now, this is the belief that Jesus gave the full authority of the church to his 12 apostles in the sacrament of holy orders, making them the first bishops. Jesus, by conferring the holy orders on the apostles, it is believed, gave them the authority to likewise do so to future bishops. Therefore, with Peter being the head bishop, naturally through apostolic succession, he passed on his authority to future bishops of Rome. Now, the reality is that there is no explicit record of Peter's leadership or the transmission of apostolic authority from the Bible, and this is something which Protestants will point out to deny the necessity of apostolic succession or the papacy. But again, this video isn't about who's right, but rather what Catholicism teaches. Nevertheless, these critiques should not be wholly dismissed, as they are rooted in certain key historical facts. Regardless of whether Peter was the first bishop of Rome or not, it is mostly agreed by scholars that the church in Rome at the time was led by a college of elders or presbyters rather than one bishop. What happened was that at the end of the first and at the start of the second century, a church hierarchy developed with overseers or bishops, elders or priests, and deacons. The bishops would appoint the priests. Now, one person who is very important in the development of the papacy and the early church as a whole is a bishop named Ignatius of Antioch, who wrote a series of letters that form much of what we know about Christian doctrine and practice at the same time, and was the first person to refer to a Catholic or universal church. He died sometime in the early 2nd century and was the first proponent of this new hierarchical system in the church in order to emphasize unity and obedience, the hierarchy being the bishop, the priest, and the deacon. He also said that the church in Rome presided in love over other churches, which has been used to justify the idea that the church in Rome was always authoritative over other churches. But if this is the case, who was the bishop of Rome at the time? Well, that was a man named Clement of Rome, who is considered the first apostolic father, and either the third, the fourth, or the fifth pope. In fact, this uncertainty about which place he is reflects how ill-defined the papacy likely was at the time. Now, Clement is notable for his letter to the church in Corinth over a dispute which had led to certain elders or priests being deposed. He opposed this, justifying it by claiming that their appointment by the apostles had proved their legitimacy. Now, this is the first written affirmation of the doctrine of apostolic succession, and his letters telling other churches what to do has been interpreted by Catholics as proof that the Bishop of Rome has always believed himself to have authority over other churches. If this is true, it would be quite remarkable, since Clement wrote his letter around 100, right at the turn of the century. However, all this is still vague enough, where I would say it's hard to argue that the role of the Roman bishop was interpreted as such by the time. Instead, things become clearer when we see the works of Ireaeneus, the bishop of Lugdunum, and perhaps the most important church father before the legalization of Christianity, who had a major impact on the church. Ireaeneus is notable for his work against heretics, which is called Against Heresies, and he wrote this in 180. In this text, he was the first to explicitly state that the sources of church authority were the scriptures, the tradition of the apostles, and the teachings of their successors, and therefore affirmed the idea of apostolic succession as being at least somewhat commonly believed at the time. This provides a more solid claim to the papacy, whose history Ireaeus was also the first to ever record. In his work, Ireaeus also wrote a list of the bishops of Rome, starting with Peter up to Pope Eluetherius. But most importantly for us, he stated that if there are disputes in the local church, it should be referred to the Church of Rome, because it contains the tradition preserved by all churches. He also wrote that Rome was, quote, the greatest, most ancient, and well-known church, founded and established by the two most glorious apostles, Peter and Paul. Therefore, by 180 at least it seems, that not only was there a list of popes, but their authority from apostolic succession and their role as leaders of the church was recognized by at least some Christians, including Ireaeus. Now, I personally like to refer to Ireaeus as the first Catholic, because he is the first person to affirm all the essential Catholic doctrines, such as the primacy of the Pope, apostolic succession, the equal authority of tradition and scripture, and was also the first person to truly delve into Mariology. But we won't be talking about Mary here, that is a whole different rabbit hole. What is important to know here is that by the late 2nd century, the role and authority of the Pope was becoming somewhat more defined and structured, as compared to before. Another early believer in Peter's authority as leader of the church was Clement of Alexandria, a theologian from the late 2nd century who was considered a church father. However, we should not be fooled to believe that this means that by the 3rd century, everyone was on board with the idea that the Bishop of Rome was the leader of the church as a whole. Tertullian, the first theologian to write in Latin, and who has been called the father of Western theology, wrote a text called Scorpiace in 208. In it, he wrote that Jesus had indeed given the keys of the kingdom of heaven to Peter, but added that it was then passed by Peter to the whole church, which he defined as everyone who confessed faith in Jesus. Now, this is remarkably similar to a Protestant interpretation, and perhaps explains part of why he isn't considered a saint. This is the first statement that explicitly states that Peter wasn't the only one with the keys to the kingdom of heaven, and reveals there was not universal agreement on who held the authority that came from it. Nevertheless, 12 years later, he wrote insisting that Jesus had given the keys to Peter alone, and it was Peter, not Jesus, who extended this authority to the church as a whole. Now, one other important development which reveals the limits of the early pope was the Quartodeciman controversy. Now, that might just sound like some weird word, but it basically comes from the Latin word for 14. Now, this dispute arose because churches in Asia Minor, so that is basically Western Turkey today, celebrated Easter on Jewish Passover, as Jesus had originally done. And I think that's the 14th of Nisan, so that's where the 14 comes in. Whereas Christians in the Western Roman Empire celebrated it on the following Sunday. This led Pope Victor I to call a council in Rome in 193 and then send a letter to Bishop Polycrates of Ephesus, who called his own council with local bishops and firmly rejected Victor's authority. Victor responded by trying to cut off Polycrates and his followers from the church, but later reversed his decision after other bishops, including Ireaeus, funnily enough, recommended for him to be more tolerant. Now, this incident has been interpreted by some Eastern Orthodox Christians as the first example of the Eastern churches resisting papal overreach and arrogance. Either way, though, it shows that by this time the authority of the Bishop of Rome was not recognized by the entire church, and that he'd even been forced to reverse a decision he had made. However, this equally shows that by then, the Bishop of Rome believed himself to have authority over all churches, at least to some degree, and this is a pivotal moment. One of the most important defenders of the Pope's authority was Cyprian, who became the Bishop of Carthage in 248. In his writing, he asserted that Peter was the rock on which the church was built. He insisted that there was one God, one Christ, and one church, and most importantly, one bishop who had the authority of the rock. In 251 in his work called On the Unity of the Catholic Church, he stated that anyone who deserted the chair of Peter or the Bishop of Rome should seriously consider whether they can be considered a part of the church at all. 3 years later, he wrote to Pope Stephen I, asking him to instruct the bishops of Gaul to condemn Bishop Marcianus of Arles for refusing to readmit Christians who had renounced their faith and repented. He stressed the primacy of Peter and the Pope as the only direct heir of Peter, and said that the Church of Rome is the root and the matrix of the Catholic Church. Now, during this entire time, Christianity was not a legal religion. It had gone through various persecutions, and in fact, the persecution that had just preceded, called the Decian persecution between 249 and 251, had caused the controversy because many Christians had been forced to sacrifice to the Roman gods. Many of them caved in, and then later on they felt bad about it, and certain bishops were telling them that they could not rejoin the church. But Christianity was legalized in the Roman Empire by its new emperor Constantine the Great in 313. Now, in 325, he famously held the Council of Nicaea as the first ecumenical council. In other words, this is basically the first worldwide conference of bishops where they decided to resolve church disputes and establish a state-approved and united church. Although the main focus was on combating heresy, it is notable that the Bishop of Rome was recognized as the first among equals of the bishops assembled at the council. However, despite Constantine's conversion to Christianity and its adoption by all his Roman successors except Julius, the Roman Empire remained officially pagan till 380, when Nicene Christianity was adopted as the official religion. The new emperor, Theodosius the Great, called a second ecumenical council at the new capital in Constantinople. This became known as the First Council of Constantinople and was held in 381. But what matters for our story here is that it revealed the split that was emerging within the Roman Church over the Pope's role. Canon 3 of the Council elevated the Bishop of Constantinople to a position of honor second only to Rome because of its founding by Constantine as the new Rome. Now, this was very strongly opposed by Pope Damasus I. He used Jesus' appointment of Simon as Peter as the basis of his primacy over other bishops. Damasus was known for asking Jerome, a famous priest, theologian, and historian, to make a Latin translation of Scripture. Jerome was living near Antioch at the time as a hermit, but 3 people were claiming to be its bishop. So Jerome wrote to Pope Damasus to ask him which of the 3 was legit. Paulinus II eventually was determined to be the real bishop by the Pope, and he later ordained Jerome and attended the council Damasus held in 382 to determine what books would be included in the Bible. In fact, it is this council in Rome that forms the basis of the Catholic Bible to this day. He's also the first pope who had images made of him that survive to this day, and so from now on, the images I'm showing for the popes will not just be mere imaginations of what we think they look like. Damasus I died in 384 and was succeeded by Pope Siricius, who issued the first decretal in 385, or a papal letter that formulates church law. Siricius also went one step further and declared that no bishop could take office without his knowledge, revealing his belief that he had authority over all bishops in the world. Now, this was the first time a bishop of Rome had explicitly tried to claim authority outside Italy. And due to this, from now on, I will no longer refer to the Bishop of Rome, but use the term Pope exclusively from now on. This newly found authority was supported by many in the Western Nicene Church, such as the famous Bishop Augustine of Hippo, who is considered one of the most important Latin Church fathers, and whose writings deeply influenced the development of Western Christianity. He wrote in 395 that since Peter was the first among the apostles, he represented the Church as a whole, and that is why Jesus did not give the keys to the kingdom of heaven to any other apostle. However, one argument which does bolster the Catholic claim is that papal primacy was not just recognized by the Western Church fathers such as Cyprian and Augustine, but also by Eastern ones, such as John Chrysostom, who became Bishop of Constantinople in 398. He called Peter the leader of the choir, the mouth of the apostles, the head of that tribe, the ruler of the whole world, the foundation of the church, and the ardent lover of Christ. Wow, those are quite flattering words, especially for someone who denied Jesus 3 times. But anyways, after the death of Pope Siricius in 401, he was succeeded by Pope Innocent I, who played another crucial role in the development of the papacy and modern theories of papal primacy developed under him. It was also during his time that most bishops recognized his primacy over other bishops in the western part of the now divided Roman Empire. He famously claimed that all major cases in the church should be reserved to him. This was a stance that was taken up by Pope Boniface I, who succeeded him in 418, who told other bishops that he was the head of the church. And in fact, this increasing authority was backed both by the Western Roman Emperor Valentinian III and the Eastern Roman Emperor Theodosius II. One of the most important people in articulating the Pope's role was Leo I, who became Pope in 440, and who, in his edicts and councils, affirmed the right to exert the full range of apostolic powers that Jesus had bestowed on Peter. At the Fourth Ecumenical Council, held in Chalcedon in 451, Leo I stated that he was speaking with the voice of Peter. When a new attempt was made to honor the Bishop of Constantinople as the second most important, Leo vehemently disagreed. He believed that it was through Peter that the other apostles received their strength and stability, so every pope possessed the full authority granted to him by God. He went one step further and used the law to make the pope the legally recognized heir of Peter by the Roman government. The council agreed with him and gave the pope the title of the most holy and beloved of God and ecumenical archbishop and great patriarch of Rome. The Council of Chalcedon was mainly there to condemn the idea that Jesus had one nature, but this elevation of the papacy played some role in the decision of the Oriental Orthodox Church to split after the council. Now, Pope Gelasius I, who ruled from 492 to 496, stated that he had the right to judge the entire church, and is not allowed for anyone to judge its judgments. In 498, meanwhile, Pope Symmachus took office and became the first pope to appoint a bishop outside of Italy. However, his papacy also marks the beginning of the papacy as a tool of corruption and political control. In fact, he was the first ever pope to only get his position because of a bribe. Now, it's important to step back here and understand the political context. The late 4th to late 5th century saw enormous changes in Europe, as the Roman Empire split permanently in 395, and its western half had collapsed by 476. Over time, the authority of the Western Roman Emperor became weaker, especially as he was unable to defend Rome from being sacked by the Goths in 410 and the Vandals in 455, and in fact, Rome wasn't even the capital by then. Now, when the Huns were also about to sack Rome, it was actually the Pope, not the Emperor, who convinced them to leave the city. With this rapidly declining imperial authority, many began turning to the increasingly power-hungry popes for guidance. The popes wanted to assert their authority over the church, while the Western Roman population wanted a sense of security and guidance, which he could provide. Once the empire fell in 476, it was the pope who effectively replaced the emperor, since he at least had spiritual authority over what had once been the empire's territory. While this might seem somewhat irrelevant, it can be overstated how much the collapse of imperial authority empowered the pope, especially when we compare him to the bishops in the Eastern Roman Empire, which would survive another 1,000 years. Nevertheless, Rome would not stay under barbarian control forever, and Justinian would manage to reconquer the city in 536. Although it was under Roman control after 60 years, that had been enough to elevate the status of the pope to such a degree that by then only the Bishop of Rome could use the title. Now, I should actually mention what the word pope means. It comes from the Greek word papas, which then translates into Latin papa, which means father, although not father officially, more like dad or daddy to be specific. Basically, an endearing word towards your father. Now, one of the most important popes of this time was Gregory I, or Gregory the Great. He was not a big fan of Eastern Roman Emperor Maurice, who had elevated the Patriarch of Constantinople as equal to him. In response, Gregory adopted the very humble-sounding title of Servant of the Servants of God. But don't let this fool you. This was a way to show that he was actually so humble that nobody could outrank him. And it basically comes from the idea that the Christian leader should be a servant. So if you're the servant of the servant, then you are the leader of the leaders. Gregory made many reforms to the papacy and essentially shaped it into the form that it would take throughout the Middle Ages. After Maurice was deposed by Phocas, Gregory praised him as the restorer of liberty. This flattery worked, and although Gregory died in 604, Phocas appointed Boniface III 3 years later and proclaimed him the universal bishop and the head of all the churches, transferring those titles away from Patriarch Siricius II of Constantinople, who was seeking recognition as the universal bishop. It might seem that this finally settled the dispute, but politics would get in the way soon once more. Eastern Roman emperors, as they did wherever they went, saw themselves as the spiritual custodians of their population. As such, they often imposed their authority over the bishops and would not tolerate an independent clergy. Therefore, most popes found themselves effectively dictated to by the Exarch of Ravenna, who was the Eastern Roman ruler of Italy. This control, combined with the weakening of the empire after the Muslim invasions in the 7th century and the empire's increased inability to defend Rome, caused the Pope to reconsider whether the situation actually benefited him. Now, when Rome was conquered by the Lombards in 751, this caused newly elected Pope Stephen II to turn to the rising Franks to protect him. The Franks were the most powerful so-called barbarian kingdom, and had been Chalcedonian Christian for 2.5 centuries. But most importantly, they had two key advantages. They were powerful and they were Western. They were powerful because, unlike the Visigoths, who ruled in Spain, they had actually managed to defeat the Muslims. And they were Western because not only were they geographically in the West, mostly being in modern-day France, Belgium, etc., but they were also spiritually Western because they were under the Pope's influence and the Pope's theology, rather than that of the Eastern Roman Emperor. Therefore, the Pope made a quite wise choice when he turned to the new king of the Franks, Pepin the Short, who had become king right as Rome had fallen to the Lombards in 751. Pepin forced the Lombards to return the land they had conquered in 756, but instead of returning it to the Eastern Romans, who had just lost the land, he returned it to the Pope directly. In exchange, Pope Stephen anointed him as the king of the Franks officially, which gave him a lot of legitimacy among his Christian population. The land Stephen now ruled became known as the Papal State, and this marked the first time a pope was not just a spiritual leader, but also a political ruler, and ruled a strip of land that crossed central Italy that became known, as I said, as the Papal States. Pepin the Short died in 768 and was succeeded by his son Charlemagne, who got the name, by the way, that means Charles the Great, for his many conquests and the transformation of the kingdom into the largest and strongest in Western Europe since the fall of the Western Roman Empire. In fact, he was so similar to the Western Roman emperors of old that he would eventually be proclaimed emperor, especially after a woman conveniently took the throne in the Eastern Roman Empire in 797, which Pope Leo III declared to be invalid because women were not allowed to rule. He therefore used the opportunity to crown Charlemagne as the first Holy Roman Emperor on Christmas 800, which, is a pretty nice Christmas gift. This established a new precedent that nobody could become emperor in the West without being crowned by the Pope first. Therefore, we see that by 800, the role of the Pope had become very clear. He was not only the Bishop of Rome, but the ultimate and unquestioned head of the Church, who had the sole right to appoint bishops, issue decretals, and develop doctrine, without interference from anyone, whether bishop or emperor. He was also a secular ruler who had to administer his territory and at times defend it violently from threats. The only thing left to change was how the Pope would be chosen. In 769, the Lateran Council barred the people from choosing the Pope, and set up the College of Cardinals, which still exists to this day. Nearly a century later, in 858, Nicholas I, the last pope to be called the Great, became the first one to be officially crowned, all but cementing his monarch-like status and starting a tradition that would continue until 1963. Despite the growing power and independence of his papacy, his authority had never been accepted in the Eastern Chalcedonian Church, and this would become very apparent throughout the 9th century, as Eastern and Western missionaries competed to convert the Slavs. The tensions kept boiling over the centuries, eventually resulting in the Great Schism in 1054. Michael I Cyrillarius, the Bishop of Constantinople, tried to bolster his position by officially proclaiming himself as ecumenical patriarch, something which the popes had explicitly forbidden. This eventually resulted in Pope Leo IX sending a legate to officially excommunicate him, although this legate didn't realize that the Pope actually had died before he even arrived in Constantinople. Michael then responded by excommunicating the Pope, who actually was dead, and this marked the official split of the Chalcedonian Church into the Roman Catholic and the Eastern Orthodox churches. This would make Leo IX's successor, Victor II, who took the throne in 1055, technically the first pope of the Catholic Church, since now he had undisputed authority over the church for the first time since there were no longer any Eastern Christians questioning it. Now, eventually there were attempts to heal this divide, but a lot of bitterness existed after the Catholic Crusaders sacked Constantinople in 1204, which put an end to the Eastern Roman Empire. Now, 57 years later, Michael VIII Palaiologos reunited the Eastern Roman Empire after reconquering their city. Now, despite this bitter history, he tried to seize the moment to create unity and called for a new council to put their differences aside. This became known as the 1272 Council of Lyon, where it was declared that the Roman Church possessed, quote, the supreme and full primacy and authority over the universal Catholic Church. Although Emperor Michael agreed to this arrangement, his clergy absolutely did not, and after his death a decade later, his successor Andronicus II fully rejected the union. The authority of the papacy would come to be seriously questioned again when the Catholic Church split with itself once the Pope moved out of Rome to Avignon in 1307 because a French king wanted to supervise him better. Now, the fact that for 70 years the Bishop of Rome never even set foot in Rome will never not be funny to me. Now, when he eventually came back, nobody could choose a successor, and so you got the weird situation where there was one pope in Rome and another one in Avignon, both claiming to be the real deal and excommunicating the other as a heretic. In an attempt to solve the schism, a new pope was decided upon, but neither pope resigned, so for a few years you had 3 popes who existed at the same time. Man, that would be a confusing time to be Catholic at the time. Now, this was eventually solved in 1417, but it was exactly a century later that the papacy would face the greatest threat ever to their authority. This, of course, was the Reformation started by Martin Luther, who questioned several corrupt practices in the now decadent Catholic Church. Now, if you want to learn more about the Reformation, I may have already made a 3.5-hour documentary series and a whole playlist on it, so I am not going to go into any details about the Reformation. Needless to say, though, the Pope was not a fan of Luther, and when Pope Leo X refused to support Luther's position, Luther responded by proposing an idea of the invisible church, or that the church was not actually just one denomination, sect, or institution, but was the body of all true believers. He eventually came to call the Pope the Antichrist, and his rejection of authority led to many other individuals breaking away from the Catholic Church and forming Protestant denominations. The Reformation led to the weakening of the political power of the Pope in Europe, since he effectively lost control of much of the north of the continent. But within the Catholic Church, the Counter-Reformation reaffirmed all his titles, duties, and privileges. The status of the papacy would not change much for 3.5 centuries until 1870, when a battle between 2 Catholic factions resulted in the victory of Ultramontanism over Conciliarism at the First Vatican Council. Now, in case you're wondering what the heck these words mean, Ultramontanism was the belief in the total authority of the Pope, while Conciliarism believed that council played a much more important role. This was codified in the document Pastor Aeternus, the first dogmatic constitution of the Catholic Church, which defined 4 major doctrines. These were the primacy of Peter, in other words, that Peter was indeed the leader of the church, the continuation of this leadership through apostolic and papal succession, the definition of papal primacy as papal supremacy, so therefore the Pope was not just first among equals, but was the actual leader of the church, and a new doctrine called papal infallibility. This doctrine taught that the Pope was infallible while defining dogma ex cathedra, which meant that he was incapable of making a doctrinal error. The fact that this happened in 1870, right when Italy conquered the Papal States and left the Pope without political power for the first time in 11 centuries, may just be a coincidence, although I'm inclined to believe that this spiritual upgrade may have something to do with the fact that he lost all political authority. Pope Pius IX therefore found himself as the first pope in centuries to not rule any territory, although when the Vatican State was created in 1929, Pope Pius XI, not to be confused with the ninth, became the first pope to once again rule over territory. Another Vatican Council was held nearly a century later, in 1963, which affirmed all the doctrines of the First Council, but clarified that the bishops were not actually representatives of the Pope, but of Jesus himself. Instead, they formed a college led by the Pope. And this has been the way it has been ever since, up until the new Pope, Leo XIV. So we have done a thorough examination of the papacy, especially its origins. But now comes the part we've all been waiting for. Who is the first pope? Well, the answer will depend on what you define as pope. Again, ask a Catholic and they'll say it was St. Peter's. But to us non-Catholics, the answer is a bit more nuanced. First of all, merely looking at the title of Bishop of Rome, it already raises the question of who even truly held that title for the first time. A bishop, at least in the modern sense, is the undisputed leader of the church in this particular city, instead of the city being ruled by a council of elders, as was the case in the early church. In that case, a strong case could be made that Clement of Rome, who served from 92 to 100, was indeed the first pope, since not only did he act as the leader of the church in Rome as a whole, but also interfered in church disputes far outside his immediate authority, and appealed to the authority of apostolic succession. However, outside of this, Clement of Rome barely resembles our modern conception of a pope. Perhaps then the answer is Pope Eluetherius, who served from 174 to 189. After all, by his time the church in Rome was considered the greatest one, especially because it was founded by Peter and Paul, and this apostolic succession from the most important apostles afforded them primacy over other churches. It was also being suggested that if church disputes arose, then it should be referred to the Bishop of Rome. However, there is little evidence to suggest that this was a majority or universally held view in the church, and as such it is doubtful that the beginning of the papacy can be marked there. So maybe the answer is Eluetherius' successor, Pope Victor I, who served from 189 to 199, and who was the first bishop of Rome to explicitly assert his authority over other churches. His decision to solve a theological dispute on the other side of the empire and try to excommunicate them for disagreeing with him certainly shows he believed that he had some sort of authority. But the fact that he had to back down reveals the limits of his power, a scenario which is not really imaginable today. So then maybe the answer is Pope Stephen I, who served from 254 to 257. After all, Cyprian appealed to him to deal with problematic bishops, and saw the Church of Rome as the core of the general church. He was also the first to suggest that anyone not in communion with the Bishop of Rome could not truly be a Christian, which has basically been the stance of the Catholic Church ever since. He stressed the primacy of Peter and how this meant that only the Bishop of Rome could lead the church. Nevertheless, it is unclear how much Stephen shared these views himself, and he certainly did not act as if he led the whole church. Despite this, the modern understanding of the role and authority of the church was most explicitly defined by then. So, Stephen I remains as a strong contender. One could perhaps argue for Pope Sylvester I, who was officially recognized as first among equals at the First Council of Nicaea in 325, the first ecumenical council which forms the foundation of much of Christianity to this day. However, this led to little practically, and most likely was more of a symbolic title rather than one with any real force. So then maybe the title should go to Pope Damasus I, who served from 366 to 384. He is a very strong contender since he is the first ever bishop of Rome to contend with any other bishop being recognized as a spiritual equal, and was the first to justify his claim using scripture, something which the previous popes had not done. In addition to this, he also claimed the authority to choose a legitimate bishop on the other side of the empire, and was also the person in charge of canonizing the Bible for the entire Western Church, something which revealed the amount of authority he had by then. He thus explicitly claimed authority over all bishops, created the Bible, and saw himself as the arbiter of legitimacy, all of which are powers that modern popes have. However, an equally strong case could be made for its pope successor, Pope Siricius, who served from 384 to 399. He was the first pope to begin actually creating church law, declared that he alone had authority to appoint all bishops, and was the first to actually do it outside of Italy, all of which are key powers of any pope. The fact that all these powers were even recognized by the Bishop of Constantinople at the time is quite revealing, especially since that had always been his main rival. Nevertheless, it wasn't until Pope Innocent I, who served from 401 to 417, that most Western bishops formally recognized his power over the church as a whole, although it should be said that the emperors of both halves of the Roman Empire also began to do so at this time, so he had both church and political support. It could be argued that Pope Leo I, who ruled from 440 to 461, was the first pope. However, because not only did he defend his position as superior to all bishops, but also explicitly referred to himself as the voice of Peter, and was the first to get his title as Peter's successor legally recognized by the government. Not only that, he was the first pope to take political authority and show himself to be not just Rome's spiritual leader, but also its political leader. The combination of spiritual and political authority therefore makes Leo I a strong contender for the first pope, if you define the papacy through that lens. Pope Symmachus, who ruled from 498 to 514, can be considered the first pope from a very cynical lens, since he was the first person to use corruption to obtain the position. But he was also the first person to actually appoint bishops outside of Italy. Now, it could also be claimed that Gregory I, who ruled from 590 to 604, was the first pope, since the medieval papacy was basically formed during his rule, and he asserted papal independence. But aside from this, he changed relatively little. Perhaps a strong claim could be made for Boniface III, whose short rule in 607 solidified the pope's status as a universal head of the church, and more importantly, permanently took away that status from the Bishop of Constantinople. However, a very strong case could be made instead for Stephen II, who ruled from 752 to 757, because he broke free of all political control, and most importantly became the first pope to rule territory, something that every pope, with a brief exception of 59 years, has done. His decision to create the Papal States created a precedent for combining political and religious power, and if you see the Pope as a political figure as well as a religious one, then perhaps for you he's the first Pope. Now, to be technical, you could argue Victor II, who served from 1055 to 1057, was the first pope, since he was the first undisputed leader of the Catholic Church, now that it had split from the Eastern Orthodox, who never accepted their authority. It would be very hard to seriously consider any claimant for the first pope after him, though, since by this time every single important aspect of the papacy had already been determined, both doctrinally and practically. The only contenders perhaps are Pius IX, who was the first to claim infallibility. Again, though, this is merely an upgrade and nothing fundamental. And Pius XI, who was the first pope to once again rule territory, though again I think nobody would credibly argue that the papacy was created in 1929. So now to the most important part. Who do I believe was the first pope? Well, as we've seen, the papacy is an institution that developed over centuries, and claiming any one person as the first pope is pretty hard unless you're going by Peter. Now, while it is clear that St. Peter had nothing to really do with the day-to-day of the popes today, there's also a point where the role of the pope becomes recognizable to us. I would argue that the transition happened in the late 4th century, after Christianity became the state religion of the Roman Empire. The Pope had the prestige of being the bishop of the capital, he enjoyed political support, the unequivocal allegiance of the Western Empire's Christian, had a fixed Bible to rely on to justify his authority, and increasingly had the law to enforce his claims, which were being disputed at several councils. It was also at this time that they began explicitly referring to themselves as the only head of the church, and therefore having the only authority to create church laws, appoint and depose bishops. Therefore, the three strongest contenders are Popes Damasus I, Siricius, and Innocent I. An equally strong case could be made for all three, but I would say that Damasus I laid the groundwork by claiming authority over all other bishops and the right to appoint them. I would say that Innocent I was the first to actually act as pope, since he was the first to obtain the recognition of his claim by most bishops and both Roman emperors. However, I would say that if I had to choose one, I would pick Siricius, because he represented the middle point between making the claims and actually getting the recognition. He was the first to not just declare that he had the power to appoint bishops outside of Italy, but the first to actually do so, and was the first to actually interpret doctrine by creating church laws. While being quite unknown, I think the popes owe more to him than perhaps anyone else. But regardless, I know that this will not be a universally accepted position, and nor should it be. But now, what do you guys think? Which of these men do you think would be the first one that you would recognize as the Pope? And of course, I'm especially addressing this to the non-Catholics. Don't forget to comment down below who you think is the first man to really embody the power of the papacy. Now again, of course, thank you all for watching this video. It is actually going to be my birthday tomorrow, May 10th. So, if this video does come out on May 10th, then that means today. But regardless, I appreciate all of you for having listened this long. Hopefully you found it interesting. Hopefully you know a little bit more about the papacy. Now, because it is my birthday, of course, I would appreciate a like, a view, subscribe. And most importantly, though, comment down below. The comments are really what keeps me going. And especially for my birthday, I think it'd be cool if you left a comment. But yeah, otherwise, tell me your thoughts on who you think the first pope is. Maybe your thoughts on who our current pope is. And until then, I will see you next time.